Look closely at the turban worn by the girl in Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring. Ignore the pearl for a moment. Ignore the enigmatic gaze that has captivated millions. Focus entirely on the blue. It is not merely a color, it is a vibration. It possesses a depth that seems to recede into the canvas and project outward simultaneously, a luminous, electric resonance that defies the aging process of oil and varnish. This is not the dull greenish cast of azurite, the common copper-based substitute that turns muddy with time. This is something else entirely. This is the sound of the ocean trapped in stone. This is ultramarine. To understand the sheer audacity of this pigment, we must look at Titian's Bacchus and Ariadne. The sky there does not just depict the heavens, it physically embodies the concept of infinity. The intensity of that blue was a deliberate, violent interruption of the earth tones that dominated the Renaissance palette. When you stand before these canvases in the quiet, dust-mote-filled air of a museum, you are witnessing a chemical miracle that survived centuries. But the story of this color begins far from the quiet studios of Venice or Delft. It begins in the geological violence of the Hindu Kush Mountains. The word itself, ultramarinus, is Latin for beyond the sea. It was a geographer's term before it was an artist's tool. It signaled that this substance was alien, an import from a world that most Europeans would never see and could scarcely imagine. For 6,000 years, the only source of high-quality lapis lazuli, the semi-precious stone from which the pigment is ground, was the Sar-i Sang mines in the Badakhshan province of modern-day Afghanistan. Just imagine the logistics. Before it could become the robe of a Madonna, this stone had to be quarried from jagged cliffs, carried by donkey through treacherous mountain passes, and transported thousands of miles along the Silk Road. It passed through the hands of traders in Bactria, across the arid expanses of Persia, over the waters of the Mediterranean, and finally into the bustling ports of Venice. By the time a raw rock of lapis lazuli reached a color merchant in Europe, it had already survived a journey that killed many men. But the journey didn't end at the dock. The transformation from rock to paint was an alchemical nightmare. Unlike other minerals that could simply be crushed and mixed with oil, lapis lazuli is full of impurities, flecks of pyrite and white calcite that, if ground up with the blue lazurite, would turn the resulting paint into a dull gray mess. To extract the soul of the blue, artists and their apprentices utilized a grueling, secret process known as pastello. They would grind the stone into a powder, mix it with a dough of wax, resin, and linseed oil, and knead it for days. Then they would massage the dough underwater in a lye solution. The blue particles, being hydrophilic, would drift out into the water, while the impurities stayed trapped in the wax. The first extraction yielded the purest, deepest blue, the ultramarine. The last extraction, pale and weak, was known as ultramarine ash. It was a labor of extraction that mirrored the mining itself. You were not just buying a tube of paint, you were buying the distilled essence of a mountain, purified by weeks of human labor. This helps explain why, when we look at a Renaissance masterpiece today, the blue often feels distinct from the rest of the painting. It is physically heavier, chemically more stable, and visually more aggressive. It is a piece of the Earth's crust that refuses to fade, demanding our attention across the chasm of centuries. If you were a patron in 15th century Florence commissioning an altarpiece, you didn't just pay a flat fee for art. You signed a contract that read like a construction budget. These documents, preserved in dusty archives, reveal a distinct separation of costs. You paid for the artist's labor, for the gold leaf, and crucially, you paid separately for the ultramarine. It was listed alongside gold as a material asset, a currency in its own right. In fact, ounce for ounce, high-quality ultramarine was often more expensive than gold. To paint a sky in ultramarine was the Renaissance equivalent of paving a driveway with diamonds. It was a conspicuous consumption of the highest order, a way to transmute financial capital into spiritual capital. This economic reality dictated theological iconography. Have you ever wondered why the Virgin Mary is almost invariably depicted wearing blue? It wasn't simply because blue is the color of the sky or heaven, though those symbolic resonances existed. It was because the church and wealthy patrons wanted to honor the Mother of God with the most precious substance available to mankind. To drape her in earth tones or cheap azurite would have been an insult. The blue robe was a receipt. It signaled to the congregation that no expense had been spared in her glorification. The piety was proving in the purchasing power. When a viewer in the 1500s looked at an altarpiece, they saw the vibrant blue and instinctively understood the wealth required to put it there. The aesthetic experience was inseparable from the economic knowledge. However, this reliance on such a costly import created a fragile ecosystem for artists. The history of art is littered with stories of blue anxiety. Albrecht Dürer, usually composed, wrote frantic letters complaining about the exorbitant price of the pigment. But the most poignant example of this economic stranglehold is found in the work of Michelangelo. Look at his painting, The Entombment, housed in the National Gallery in London. It is a powerful, dynamic composition, but looking closely at the bottom right corner, you see a void. The Virgin Mary is missing. There is a blank, outlined shape where she should be. Art historians and chemists largely agree on the reason for this spectral absence. Michelangelo was waiting for the ultramarine. He likely could not afford it himself and was waiting for the commission money or the pigment delivery to arrive. It never did. The painting remains unfinished, a ghost of a masterpiece, arrested by a supply chain failure. That blank space is one of the most profound silences in art history. It is a negative space that screams of the material constraints binding even the greatest geniuses. It reminds us that the ethereal beauty of the Renaissance was tethered to the grit of commerce. Even when the paint was acquired, it was guarded like a state secret. Artists would lock their cabinets to prevent apprentices from stealing the precious powder. Some patrons, suspicious of theft, would physically supervise the artist as they ground the stone and applied the paint, ensuring that the expensive dust they paid for actually ended up on the canvas and not in the artist's pocket. The application of ultramarine was a performance of trust and mistrust. It shaped the composition of paintings. Artists would use cheaper blues for the background skies and save the true ultramarine only for the central focal points, creating a hierarchy of color that guided the eye. The viewer's gaze was literally directed by the price per ounce of the materials. We are not just looking at a representation of a scene, we are looking at a map of value, where the holiest figures are rendered in the most expensive matter. For centuries, the tyranny of the price tag ruled the palette. But the 19th century brought the dual forces of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution to bear on the problem of blue. The situation had become untenable. Wars and political instability in the East often cut off the supply of lapis lazuli entirely, leaving European academies scrambling for alternatives. The desire for a stable, affordable blue became a matter of national urgency. In 1824, the French Société d'Encouragement offered a massive prize of 6,000 francs to anyone who could synthesize a chemical substitute for lapis lazuli at a fraction of the cost. The race was frantic, a chemical arms war. In 1826, a French chemist named Jean-Baptiste Goumet claimed the prize. He had discovered that by heating kaolin, sodium carbonate, and sulfur in a kiln, he could produce a substance chemically identical to the lapis extract. It was called French ultramarine. Almost overnight, the price of the divine color collapsed. What was once the exclusive domain of the Virgin Mary and the ultra-wealthy became available to everyone. You can see the explosion of blue in the decades that followed. The Impressionists, Renoir, Monet, Van Gogh, drenched their canvases in it. They used it not just for focal points, but for shadows, for water, for the very air itself. The democratization of ultramarine changed the way the world was painted. Shadows were no longer black. They were deep, vibrating violet blues. The sacred color became the color of a riverbank on a Sunday afternoon. But as the material value of the pigment plummeted, a new philosophical value began to emerge. If blue was no longer defined by its scarcity, what was it defined by? Enter Yves Klein in the mid-20th century. Klein was an artist obsessed not with the object, but with the immaterial, the void, the sky, the infinite. He felt that binders and oils deadened the pure resonance of the pigment. He wanted the powder to look as vibrant on the canvas as it did in the jar. Working with a chemist, he developed a resin that suspended the pigment particles without dulling their luster, creating a velvety, matte surface that seemed to absorb light and pull the viewer into a deep, disorienting space. He didn't just use the color, he patented it. International Klein Blue. This was the final ironic twist in the story of ultramarine. In the Renaissance, the value came from the stone itself, the geography, the mining, the logistics. With Klein, the value came from the intellectual property, the concept, the artist's signature. He painted entire canvases in nothing but this single, vibrating hue. Standing before a Klein monochrome is a radically different experience than looking at a Titian. You are not looking at a picture of something. You are facing the sensation of blueness itself.
Klein famously said that blue has no dimensions. It is beyond dimensions. From the jagged mines of Afghanistan to the unfinished receipt of Michelangelo, and finally to the conceptual void of modernism, ultramarine has remained humanity's attempt to capture the intangible. We ground up the mountains to paint the sky, only to realize that the color was never about the rock at all. It was about our longing for the horizon. It was about the distance. Whether worth more than gold or mass-produced in a factory, this specific frequency of light continues to haunt us. It reminds us that while we are creatures of the earth, our eyes are forever drawn to the beyond. The history of art is, in many ways, just the history of our attempt to touch that blue.